Queria pedir desculpas, Kevin, pelo atraso. Acho que você já, Isa e Luciana, te receberam. Bom te receber, Kevin. Um prazer grande ter você aqui conosco. Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Mais um encontro do Tiaços. Vou apresentar o Kevin para a gente. Kevin vai falar hoje sobre um tema fundamental: estratégias para revisar e descolonizar currículos junguianos e pós-junguianos, né? Um tema bastante pertinente. O Kevin é professor titular e diretor dos estudos junguianos e pós-junguianos no Departamento de Estudos Psicossociais e Psicanalíticos da Universidade de Essex. Ele é ex-membro do Comitê Executivo da Associação Internacional de Estudos Junguianos e membro do corpo docente adjunto da Pacifica Graduates. As publicações do Kevin incluem artigos e capítulos sobre as relações de Jung com a disciplina de História, o uso da psicologia analítica por Arnold Toynbee, avaliações críticas da teoria dos complexos culturais, relações entre irmãos na diáspora chinesa vietnamita e perspectivas junguianas sobre a história em quadrinhos e suas adaptações para o cinema. Kevin, prazer te receber. Muito obrigado por você ter aceito o nosso convite. O tema, por si só, já é um tema bastante atual e pertinente, e ainda mais para nós, brasileiros, com o nosso passado de grande colônia que fomos, e talvez não sabemos ainda se continuamos a ser ou não, mas toda essa questão sobre um discurso colonial, ele está muito presente hoje na agenda brasileira, política, social. Então, tentar pensar esse tema junto com a psicologia analítica e sob as tuas palavras, não poderia ter melhor ocasião. Te agradeço o convite, palavras são suas.
Great, thank you very much, Isa. First and foremost, I want to thank Marcus and Luciana for this wonderful opportunity. And I also want to thank Isa for the simultaneous translation tonight. And just to begin, seeing former Essex colleagues and students here just, really brings back great memories. So Guy, fantastic to see you. Camilla, fantastic to see you as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. So I will start the presentation now. I will share screen. And let me just start my slides from the beginning. Here we go. Oops. Someone just give me a thumbs up. Okay, I'm assuming colleagues can see that. So I want to start this lecture with a vignette. So in March 2020, I attended an event on race and culture held by the Guild of Psychotherapists, where my former colleague, Naz Kaval, who's a Kleinian psychotherapist, and Dr. Shona Hunter from Leeds Beckett were speaking. And during one of the Q&A sessions, someone from the audience bemoaned how little awareness there was on issues of race within psychotherapy trainings. This individual then said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "At least the Jungians have published an open letter on Jung's writings on Africans. They seem much more ahead of the game, and I'm actually quite envious, and I want to be a Jungian." So there was a part of me that took a bit of kind of slight joy, but at the same time, this does not mean we rest on our laurels. We need to build on this momentum and awareness. And what I really want to focus on today is not so much the theorizing of it. I've done a bit of that previously, but on the action side of it. So thinking about the thinking aspect, if you want to think about typology, but what does the sensation aspect looks like? What does the action actually look like? Now, in this regard, I am empowered by Jungian and post-Jungian colleagues who are scholars, therapists, clinicians, and those who, borrowing Andrew Samuels's recent term, are good enough all-rounders, who have written on this topic and have been allies and advocates of greater awareness, some deceased, most alive, and many still very, very active. So Andrew Samuels, James Hillman, Michael Vanoy Adams, Fanny Brewster, Alan Vaughan, Mary Watkins, Helen Morgan, Robin McCoy Brooks, Ruth Callan, Frida Fordham, Arnold J. Toynbee, Jane Johnson, Sulanya Sengupta, Hannah Henenberg, and more recently, Christopher Carter. And I will return to Chris's work as well. And this is not, this list itself is not exhaustive. You know, there are many more people who've written on this topic. So I may not agree with everything that our colleagues say, and I trust they will not always agree with me. But I think we're all aware of a necessary direction of travel, and we can work together to get there because of the respective positions we hold in the various arms of the Jungian community. Yet what does decolonization actually mean? Arguably, decolonizing the curriculum has become a bit of a buzz phrase or a buzzword, and it might be helpful in the first instance to trace a trajectory of more recent events, at least within the global north, that have led us to this particular historical moment. In 2013, you have the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, which led Alicia Garza, Patricia Cullors, and Opal Tometi to coin the hashtag Black Lives Matter. In 2014, students at University College London are inspired by the I Too Am Harvard campaign and launched their own Why Is My Curriculum White campaign, taking aim at a Eurocentric curriculum, ignoring the experiences and contributions of Black and minority ethnic people, as well as obscuring the impact of slavery and colonialism. In 2015, in Cape Town, South Africa, you have the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. And this refers to a call to remove a statue of Cecil Rhodes from the Cape Town campus after a student, Shumani Maxwell, threw human feces at it to protest against the university's colonial legacy. This then spreads to the University of Oxford, where students demanded that a statue of Rhodes be removed from Oriel College, Oxford. In 2019, you have GARA, Goldsmiths Anti-Racist Action. And here, protesters occupied Deptford Town Hall in Southeast London. The major reasons for the occupation include: one, a lack of anti-racist action from senior management following a series of high-profile racist incidents on campus. Two, international students were subject to surveillance and reporting practices tied to attendance that could result in deportation. Three, Black and minority ethnic cleaning and security crews faced poor pay and working conditions, as well as the threat of outsourcing. And four, many of these workers live locally in historically working class neighborhoods, but encountered difficulties to access campus facilities, including the town hall that was eventually occupied by the protesters. Decolonization may be defined as, and I quote, the active resistance against colonial powers and a shifting of power towards political, economic, educational, cultural, psychic independence and power that originate from a colonized nation's own indigenous culture. This process occurs politically and also applies to personal and societal psychic, cultural, political, agricultural, and educational deconstruction of colonial oppression, end quote. Now, in terms of decolonizing academic programs specifically, I found Shawneen Pete's summary a strong starting point. Decolonizing initiatives within universities would require an honest examination of the violence of colonization and how this is maintained today through systems of oppression and institutions. They would include what Lenui calls the dreaming, the facilitation of learning opportunities which encourage a cultural resurgence, and a reimagining of governing, judicial, educational, and community structures designed to empower Indigenous peoples. I would add to this that, alongside the reformation of Indigenous institutions, there must be a reformation of programs directed towards non-Indigenous peoples so that they can leave behind their cognitive and experiential deficits, end quote. So when we speak of decolonizing the curriculum, we're really speaking about a university's or institution's awareness of the connection between a university's history and how it responds to calls and demands to redress a balance of power. Knowledge production is intimately connected to power, and what we teach can either challenge unfair power structures or they can sustain them. As is clear from the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, universities are infrastructures of empire and have benefited from colonialism. Decolonizing the curriculum is one way to potentially disrupt the Western project of civilization and to challenge a largely Eurocentric canon as truth. The point of decolonization is not only to deconstruct knowledge and the reproduction of one-sided accounts of what this constitutes, but to transform them into something more equitable and more reflective of the actual reality that Black and minority ethnic communities have contributed significantly to all subjects being taught within higher education. However, while a desire to disrupt these circulating discourses of domination is warranted, do they really constitute an exercise in decolonization? Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang argue, rather forcefully and persuasively, that decolonization is not a metaphor. And I would ask everyone just to bear with me. This is actually quite an important argument. So I've extracted 5 long quotations that I will read in the hopes that this really summarizes a very large and significant paper. So this is what they argue. The easy adoption of decolonizing discourse by educational advocacy and scholarship, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonize our schools, or use decolonizing methods, or decolonize student thinking, turns decolonization into a metaphor. One trend we have noticed with growing apprehension is the ease with which the language of decolonization has been superficially adopted into education and other social sciences, supplanting prior ways of talking about social justice, critical methodologies, or approaches which decenter settler perspectives. Decolonization, which we assert is a distinct project from other civil and human rights-based social justice projects, is far too often subsumed into the directives of these projects, with no regard for how decolonization wants something different than those forms of justice. When a metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness. It resettles theory. It extends innocence to the settler. It entertains a settler future. We think the enactment of these tropes as a series of moves to innocence, which problematically attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. Decolonization as a metaphor allows people to equivocate these contradictory decolonial desires because it turns decolonization into an empty signifier to be filled by any track towards liberation. In reality, the tracks walk all over land and people in settler contexts. Decolonization in the settler colonial context must involve the repatriation of land, simultaneous to the recognition of how land and relations to land have always already been differently understood and enacted. That is, all of the land, and not just symbolically. This is precisely why decolonization is necessarily unsettling. The easy adoption of decolonization as a metaphor and nothing else is a form of this anxiety, because it is a premature attempt at reconciliation. The absorption of decolonization by settler social justice frameworks is one way the settler, disturbed by her own settler status, tries to escape or contain the unbearable searchlight of complicity. Decolonization is not converting indigenous politics to a Western doctrine of liberation. It is not a philanthropic process of helping the at-risk and alleviating suffering. It is not a generic term for struggling against oppressive conditions and outcomes. The broad umbrella of social justice may have room underneath for all these efforts. By contrast, decolonization specifically requires the repatriation of indigenous land and life. Decolonization is not a metonym for social justice, end quote. So, very forceful argument, very powerful words. From my own point of view, I'm still not completely sure where I stand with this, but certainly it's a perspective that needs to be acknowledged and taken account of. We need to face, acknowledge, and reflect upon our own complicity in maintaining power structures. My thinking on the topic is constantly shifting with the more I read and the different perspectives coming to my attention. How far are we willing to go? And how much are we actually willing to give up? In many ways, the important questions being asked in Tuck and Yang's article are indicative of a symbolic mirror being held up to those who may champion anti-racist approaches and initiatives to decolonize institutions. So I want to be careful about using the term decolonize specifically without fully embracing and thinking critically about what this actually might entail, and especially if we might have the tools and language within analytical psychology itself to frame this social justice endeavor. And this moves me to perhaps the more theoretical aspect of my talk tonight, a project in revisioning. So rather than decolonizing, can we frame it in our own words? Can we frame it within the language that we already have available to us? So I suggest framing a commitment to the principles of decolonization in and through existing depth psychological discourses of transformation. In Jungian communities, this idea invites us to revisit James Hillman's earlier impetus to revision psychology. Hillman's project was to revision psychology from the standpoint of soul, where soul is defined as a perspective rather than a substance, a third space between us and events, between the doer and the deed, which makes possible a reflective moment. And soul-making means differentiating this middle ground. Revisiting Hillman's concept of revisioning from the perspective of soul seems appropriate to our specific aim to decolonize the curriculum in particular, and the practices and protocols of the academy in general. It aligns with Hillman's own commitment to address racism from a Jungian point of view, and he published this influential paper in 1986. For Hillman, the poetic basis of mind and the processes of imagination constitute the fundamental ground on which everything else rests, from the development of language, the tenets of religion, the structures of society, to the arts and human behavior. What is critical for Hillman in the process of revisioning is to override our own egocentricity, that capital I appearing in the monotheism of consciousness and in monotheistic science, as this demands, and I quote, nothing less than dethroning the dominant fantasy ruling our view of the world, adopting Jungian tools to advance the crucial project of revisioning decolonization may best be realized in the context of Jungian and post-Jungian studies as a conscious reimagining of curricula, pedagogy, and organizational cultures to reflect those aspects of Jung's thinking that champion openness, balance, integrity, and the psyche's creative potential to imagine a plurality of futures. Such an overhaul or revisioning would involve facing the inconvenient and uncomfortable truths of entrenched ideology and power structures, the biases, conscious and unconscious, that have persisted for generations. By differentiating or imaginatively exploring the middle ground of Hillman's third space, we may connect anew with multiplicity and a worldview that is diverse and unsettled, yet open to possibility. Lest all this be dismissed as hyperbolic fantasy thinking, let me now propose how such a change may be achieved slowly, strategically, consciously, and persistently. So I now want to turn my attention and focus on 3 initiatives or 3 points from which this revisioning may begin. And these are the 3 main points. Number 1, conducting an equity audit of our various programs. So that can include academic programs, but also academic components of training programs as well. Number 2, the dissemination of knowledge through events and other means. And number 3, changing policies and procedures. And I've divided this into 2 subcategories, changing our view of leadership, and in particular, looking at complaints procedures within analytic trainings. So that's what I'm pointing to in terms of B. Now, much of what I have to say is shaped by my own work as the co-chair of a tackling racism group at my university, and being empowered by Christopher Carter's article in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and in particular his appendix. Mainly, he presents a call to the IAAP to take corrective actions, publicly denunciating, but not erasing, in Carter's view, the white supremacist writings of Carl Gustav Jung. Now, some of what I'm proposing might sound obvious to some, and if that's the case, then please bear with me, because although analytical psychology has made some significant strides that other depth psychological schools have not in terms of race equality and an acknowledgement of a racist past, there's still a long way to go. We are, I believe, at the start of this journey. I'm also very keen to learn from my colleagues here tonight, especially those who are clinicians and therapists, what they think of some of these proposals. Will these work in therapeutic organizations? Will some elements work and not others, depending on the context? Can some of these suggestions be revised so that they may be implemented in more specific ways that reflect the ethos of each organization? So with that, I will start with the first point, an equity audit of Jungian and post-Jungian curricula. So very simply, my dear friends, let's count. Let's begin counting. This is a very simple yet effective method I actually picked up from a former student, Shoha Al-Jurf, who I had the pleasure of teaching through one of Pacifica's programs. And she's actually started a new Jungian blog on Spotify, so I've put a link in there for anyone who might be interested. Now, specifically, when we're doing this counting or this audit, we're looking for the proportion first of male authors to female authors, and also the balance between white authors and Black and minority ethnic authors. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on the proportion of Black and minority ethnic authors on reading lists. Now, doing so will have several limitations. The first glaring limitation is intersectionality. Race is only one point or one vertex of oppression. There are others, and these often converge into, let's say, a more combined and deleterious form of oppression. So I'll give you an example. while Black and minority ethnic males certainly face problematic conditions, Black and minority ethnic females will face even harsher conditions to try to progress through an organization, etc. So here tonight, I'm just focusing on race, but in the write-up of this presentation, which I've submitted to the British Journal of Psychotherapy, the results I present there actually take race and gender together. Now, looking at some of the other limitations before I present the results. So this approach doesn't necessarily give us a full picture of a curriculum's commitment to equality and diversity. So, for example, if I see a reading by either Helen Morgan or Michael Vinoy Adams, I could count it as being penned by a white author, but equally, both have written on the topics of multiculturalism and race, and both are allies in this endeavor of revisioning, and their commitment to multiculturalism might permeate all facets of their work. So, where do we count these particular contributions? So that's definitely a limitation. Another limitation, there's a distinction to be made between Black and minority ethnic authors located in the global north, i.e. located and perhaps raised in affluent countries located in the Northern Hemisphere, and those in the global south, i.e. those colleagues located in countries that share a similar economic profile and, more than likely, have experienced the detrimental effects of empire and colonization. So as I mentioned previously, the equality, diversity, and inclusivity initiatives of the global north may differ drastically from the global south. And those from the global north might be seen as appropriating a discourse that is in vogue, i.e. they are coming from a privileged position, most likely economic, that turns decolonization into a metaphor, as we've mentioned above. There's also the added difficulty of authors who, for example, reside and represent the global south, who may be adopting certain Eurocentric Jungian ideas without necessarily being critical about how their own contexts shape the mobilization of the idea itself. In this way, Eurocentric ideas may be perpetuated by those located in the global south. And this is something I'm more than happy to discuss a bit more of later on in the discussion period. But basically what I'm interested in is, our colleagues in the global south, not just applying the ideas, but entering into a conversation with the ideas and holding that mirror back and telling us what initiatives, what processes, what practices in the global south can enrich the way in which analytical psychology does its job. That's what I'm interested in. It's that dialogue. Now, in Jungian and post-Jungian studies, there are certain modules that are dedicated to engaging in primary source readings. So in this case, Jung's writings as found in the collected works, the Red Book, the Black Book, archival material. Now, that being the case, one might expect the proportion of white to Black and minority ethnic authors to be leaning heavily to one side, although more work would need to be done about whether Black and minority ethnic writers are proportionately represented when pointing to key commentaries or relevant secondary sources. Going to another limitation, in the UK specifically, as I'm sure it is in other countries, there's a division on syllabi between essential reading and recommended reading. So essential reading is deemed to be mandatory and thus could be read as being more important and holding a higher status than recommended readings. So a more detailed study would need to investigate not only the proportion of Black and minority ethnic authors on any given reading list, but the number of readings achieving the status of essential reading. Now, it's clear that there are a lot of gray areas and more nuanced and detailed study is certainly warranted. But conducting an initial count can provide an interesting snapshot of what the starting assumptions of a module are, or indeed, what the starting assumptions of an entire program may be, and whether or not certain perspectives are privileged over others. Now, as my example, I will take a highly popular postgraduate taught degree focusing on analytical psychology as my main example. So this particular degree is comprised of 4 modules or courses, and I will call this Course 1, Course 2, Course 3, and Course 4. So in Course 1, there were 110 readings that were assigned, and this includes both essential reading and recommended reading. 8 are identifiable as being penned by Black or minority ethnic authors, and 0 are listed as essential reading. But if we take this overall number, 8 divided by 110, that gives us 7% of this particular reading list. Moving on now to course number 2, there were 198 readings assigned. Again, that includes either essential or recommended readings. 5 readings are identifiable as being penned by a Black or minority ethnic author, but actually all 5 are penned by the same person. Now this equates to 2.5% of the reading list, and only 2 of these readings actually achieved essential reading status. Moving on now to course number 3. There are 45 readings on this particular list. 0 are written by any Black or minority ethnic authors. So we have a percentage of 0% there. Course 4, we have 161 readings assigned. 24 are identifiable as being penned by Black or minority ethnic colleagues. Of those 24, only 4 achieved the status of essential reading, but the overall average for this course is 15%. Now, if we take the program as a whole, you have a total of 514 readings, 37 of which were written by authors identifiable as Black and minority ethnic. And this gives us a percentage of 7% of the entire curriculum. However, if we look closer and categorize the readings according to essential and recommended reading, only 6 of the 37 readings penned by Black and minority ethnic authors achieved essential reading status. Those classified as recommended readings, as we said earlier, are less likely to be read and engaged with. If that's the case, then the percentage becomes even worse. 6 divided by 514 gives us 1%. So 1% of the reading list in terms of essential reading has been penned by a Black or minority ethnic author. So my dear colleagues, not only do we have a problem, but the current state of play is absolutely heartbreaking. Now, as one solution, I would encourage all colleagues to start off with the respective syllabi or courses they have a hand in designing, and also to our editors of journals to conduct a similar review. As a starting point, I would urge all colleagues who have the power to change things, and this includes me, I'm certainly at the start of this journey as well, to consider engaging more deeply with the research conducted by colleagues in the Global South, and really exploring whether these can be positioned as essential reading on our lists, how these writings might complement themes we're already covering, how they provide a different perspective, and how they will inevitably enrich the learning experience of all our students. And maybe what's really required at this point is the survey or annotated bibliography of all Indigenous and Black and minority ethnic scholars who have published works from the perspective of analytical psychology. And this is perhaps a larger project to keep in mind, and maybe something that can be a source of collaboration. Now, this change can't happen overnight. It takes time, but now is the time to start. Now, moving on to my second point. Again, how do we actually do the work? Not just thinking intellectually about the work, but how do we physically do the work? And this leads me to consider the dissemination of knowledge through events and other means. Now, I'm just going to stop share for a second so I can see most colleagues here, maybe through a show of hands, whether Black Awareness Day in Brazil, which I believe is on November 20th, whether this is celebrated in your respective Jungian Jungian organizations, either academic or clinical. So can anyone show me hands? Is Black Awareness Day in Brazil, is this celebrated in any Jungian organizations? So I'm not seeing much. Okay. So I was hoping for examples of best practice, things that we might discuss, but that's equally interesting. So I will share screen again. Right. So the whole point of posing that question is to really hammer home the point that Black history and the contribution of all minority ethnic communities to analytical psychology should be celebrated, not just in a particular month, not just on a particular day, but throughout the entire year. And let's really begin to open our eyes as to how colleagues who identify as Black or minority ethnic, but particularly those located in the global South, can help us to destabilize our Eurocentric understanding of analytical psychology. And I wonder whether we can take a more proactive step to formalize the need to learn from diverse colleagues and to be led by them. So, for example, looking at our conferences as one way knowledge is being produced and disseminated, are we now in a position to commit to setting targets for the number of Black and minority ethnic presenters at conferences? And more specifically, are we in a position to commit to setting targets for keynote speakers from the global South for each and every conference that our respective organizations run? This includes working into budgets the cost of simultaneous interpretation. The same might be applied to our journals and any special projects with which they may engage. This means, again, a commitment to translation costs and to disseminating works written in languages other than English. Committing to these initiatives necessitates representation on key decision-making committees. And this leads me to the third and final section of my talk. Sorry, everyone, just having a bit of trouble with the slides here. There we go. Apologies for that. So changing policies and procedures. And again, I've subdivided this into two categories. We have leadership, and then we also have policies. So starting with leadership, and again, I'm basing a lot of my information on my experience in the UK specifically. So across most UK higher education institutions, there are very few individuals identifying as Black and minority ethnic in the most senior leadership positions. According to research completed by Professor Kalwant Bhopal, Black and minority ethnic academic staff are less likely to be in senior managerial roles. As of 2015-16, there were 20 UK Black and minority ethnic deputy or pro-vice chancellors compared to 530 who identify as white. Among UK academic staff, only 3.9% of Black and minority ethnic staff were in senior managerial positions. In terms of obtaining professorships, or what colleagues might know as full tenure, at the time of Bhopal's book was published, 13,270 professors who identified as white were compared to a total of 1,050 who identified as Black and minority ethnic. And of those 1,050, only 70 identified as Black. Our various organizations may already be committed in writing and in principle to forwarding an EDI agenda, so equality, diversity, and inclusivity. But are they being proactive? Are they being the visionaries and trailblazing innovation rather than merely reacting to the realities of a changing external environment? One way to be proactive is to implement sponsorship programs, and this is different from mentoring, for those Black and minority ethnic colleagues who desire to progress their careers by taking on leadership roles within their respective organizations. Mentoring generally entails one person providing advice to another on key developmental areas. A sponsor, on the other hand, is much more involved. A sponsor is an advocate for the sponsored individual or party. Through the sponsor's seniority, the networks he, she, or they have built up over time, the sponsor will be a person's advocate both in public and behind closed doors. Now, obviously, the sponsored person needs to be up to the task, but it's about opening doors that may be inaccessible to some, regardless of what the regulations may state. It's about putting people forward so that they get the chance to prove themselves. And this leads me to my next point regarding leadership. The implementation of a version of the Rooney Rule. So what is the Rooney Rule? This is named after Dan Rooney, the former owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers and former chairman of the league's diversity committee. Now, the Rooney Rule is an NFL policy, a National Football League policy, that requires league teams to interview ethnic minority candidates for head coaching and senior football operations jobs. The rule has given birth to other similar rules, such as the Russell Rule in collegiate basketball and the Mansfield Rule in the practice of law. So, when leadership positions become available in our various Jungian organizations, are we in a position to implement a version of the rule, mainly that at least one diverse candidate is interviewed for the job? Committing to this means that we approach this as an honest and open act of due diligence. It's not a tick box exercise, and some have accused the rule for encouraging such practices. Arguably, it benefits everyone to have a more diverse representation in leadership positions. More diversity means a stronger representation of perspectives and angles that may be missed if leadership remains predominantly held by white individuals. Now, I'm moving into my final section, which is looking at policy specifically. So in this section, I'm really interested in investigating whether or not what people may say on the surface. So for example, using Jungian language, the persona. Does the persona of an organization, which may be on the surface championing racial equality, is that actually reflected in the policies and how they contain the anxieties and the grievances within an organization itself? So I'm looking at whether or not there's such a disparity. So I reviewed the complaints procedures of 2 Jungian clinical organizations and the code of ethics of 4 Jungian organizations. And I looked up 8 in total, and all this was done online. So I really want to know who is being transparent about this, who is actually putting up their policies for everyone to see. Now, I'm not going to name these organizations because my intent here is not to name and shame organizations, but I would applaud all those organizations that have provided on their websites, so being transparent, their code of ethics. And in particular, I applaud those that have also granted access to the complaints procedures. So what I usually found is that the complaints procedures are usually protected by a password. So only people belonging to that organization are able to access those other documents. Now, those who do provide their documents openly to anyone who wants to find them, This, to me, displays a commitment to transparency and an openness to learning that is so central to changing organizational cultures for the better. Now, in conducting this initial assessment, I only came across 2 organizations that provided diversity statements and/or statements about Black Lives Matter out of the 8 organizations I looked into. Now, I have some general comments and observations to make, but please note that I'm not working with a huge sample size here. These are some initial thoughts based on what I could find, but still, hopefully you'll find this is an interesting starting point to begin the work. So some questions that came to mind while I was looking through these policies. What's the makeup of the ethics committee? So is there a commitment to diverse representation on these committees? Now, based on my understanding, some organizations elect members onto the ethics committee and they serve for a stipulated period of time. So for example, 3 years, with a limit as to how many times membership may be renewed. So for example, for 2 additional terms. There also seems to be scope to co-opt members into the committee, presumably depending on the complexities of any case under consideration. Now, a general observation as an outsider, so someone who is not a clinician, and that struck me quite a bit, was the fact that there was very little that was said about the support being offered both to those making the complaint and those against whom a complaint is being made. Now, are these 2 parties supposed to bear the anxiety and distress of a complaint alone? Do we assume that because they're most likely analysts or analysts in training, and I include therapists in this as well, that they should be able to work this out themselves, or perhaps alongside their supervising analyst, and that the burden is on individuals rather than organizations to provide that very support? So in other words, what is the organization's responsibility to its members, in particular their mental health, in an organization dedicated to mental health, no less, during what is admittedly a very stressful period? Now, to me, if we don't align the persona with what's actually being done or said in the policies, then certainly this is a manifestation of institutional racism. That what we say on the surface looks good, but do the policies then actually reflect the image we want to put out there to the world? Now, in particular, I'm looking at or thinking of complaints or ethical cases involving accusations of racism. Now, if this occurs, and under the current protocols that I've been able to examine, there is scope to ensure that at least 1 member of the ethics committee, whether they are elected for a term or brought in specifically for that case, to be a member identifying as Black and minority ethnic. I think this is the very least that could be done to ensure fairness and to build trust and faith in the regulations themselves, i.e., that cases involving accusations of racism will be dealt with seriously and not brushed aside as a clash of personalities or relationship styles, transference, countertransference, or the constellation of a racial animus. And these are some of the things that I've actually heard in my time to brush racism aside. In fact, can there be a commitment that every case involving an accusation of racism be investigated, therefore bypassing informal resolution stages, and that an external Black and minority ethnic colleague who meets the criteria be co-opted as part of the investigation? Building trust in an organization's complaints procedure and its transparency is central to the project of revisioning Jungian and post-Jungian curricula in organizations. By adopting this approach, we're sending a clear signal regarding the seriousness with which issues of race and racism are being treated within the organization. If people don't have trust in the process, then you may see people deciding not to report certain incidents, because, hey, it won't be taken seriously. It's the old boys network at play, and the person in question will just get off anyway. They're protected. Revisioning, as I'm using it in this context, is about challenging these very power structures. Having at least one member particularly knowledgeable about these issues, where one understands what a microaggression is, what constitutes an act of racism, what structural racism is, and what institutional racism looks like, can build a more robust confidence in the process itself. I suggest that the same be done for complaints involving all protected characteristics. And in the UK, this is outlined in the Equality Act of 2010. Equally, we should be paying close attention when cases are brought against those who possess one of the protected characteristics, as outlined in the Equalities Act 2010. And this includes age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. But the reason I raise this is because of recent academic findings, and in particular, a recent critical assessment of implicit biases in student evaluations of courses and teaching by Troy Heffernan. Very briefly, student evaluations can be influenced by racist, sexist, and homophobic prejudices. The data informing student surveys is flawed and can be prejudiced against those being assessed. Assessments are influenced by student demographics, the teaching academics' culture and identity, and other criteria not associated with the course quality or the efficacy of the lecturer's delivery. More and more, these assessments feed into promotion processes, and what, on the surface, looks like a bad score, without investigating the complex motivations that may have contributed to that score, can have a deleterious impact on progression and promotion. So what you end up with is a tension between the sector's stated commitment to hiring more representatives from underrepresented groups, but members of these very groups are most likely to progress at a much slower pace and are perceived to be underperforming because of a monitoring mechanism that is deeply flawed and driven by bias. So, if we translate this into the realm of Jungian academic and clinical organizations, perhaps there's some work that needs to be done around the data surrounding the frequency with which members from underrepresented backgrounds or those possessing one of the protected characteristics are subject to complaints procedures or are called to account by ethics committees. So the next logical question is, who is actually keeping this data? Does the data actually exist? And can we look at this to pinpoint any larger trends that may be occurring, which in turn will help us devise the types of policies that can make a real impact and to ensure that a commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusivity and tackling racism are at the heart of all we do as a community. And that's the end. So I will stop sharing now.
Obrigado, Kevin. Vamos lá, vamos aos procedimentos, então, habituais. Quem quiser fazer perguntas para o Kevin, coloca o nome no chat e eu chamo a pessoa para fazer a pergunta. Kevin, vou começar. Queria te fazer duas perguntas. A primeira é, a partir da tua experiência, qual é o grau de adesão que você tem encontrado tanto na academia quanto nas instituições junguianas em relação a essa proposta? Essa proposta ela tem sido bem recebida pela comunidade junguiana institucional e ela também tem sido bem recebida dentro da comunidade acadêmica? Ou você ainda encontra pontos de resistência? Isso ainda é um projeto que você diria que levará um tempo para poder se instaurar? Como tem sido a sua experiência?
Yeah, thank you, Marcus and Isa. So I'll start it with an anecdote. So, I presented some of this data to, via another forum, and the reaction I got was actually stunned silence. And, it's not surprising. So I was actually at dinner with Andrew Samuels the other night, and we were discussing this, that, in terms of a community, the Jungian community wants to do good. There is a commitment to wanting to do the right thing and to be politically active. But I think one major hurdle, and this is really Andrew here, and I agree with him, is that there is this large gap from the desire to act and then actually acting itself. And I think that's where the big space is, that, perhaps maybe because of typology or just the nature of what we study, that we want to think, that we want to reflect. And there are some really important insights that can come from that very reflection. But I think as a community, what we need to think more about is the implementation and the acting. So what does it look like? Now, it may not look like anything I've just stated, but it's certainly a start. So you put it out there, and you see how colleagues react to it. Some may agree, some may disagree, but that's the beauty of it, because in that disagreement, new knowledge actually arises. Well, Kevin, this isn't the way to do it. And you may say to me that actually the dynamics in Brazilian organizations is quite different, and this is what it might look like. But the very fact of putting out something that may not hold true in your specific cultural context is a good step, because it tells me that these ideas, findings that I'm putting forward may hold true in one context, one Jungian context in the West, perhaps in the UK, but not in another context. And I think that's really important, Marcus, is this real notion of dialogue and not being so wedded to our Jungian heritage. I can see a lot of resistance in the sense that people might think, well, people are kind of reading into this, it's going too far, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very difficult to hold that middle position. So I can be very clear and say that my own political leaning is towards the left, towards anti-racist approaches, but equally, I can see a very good argument that is actually coming from the right, that things are being reactive, that in many instances, things are perhaps going too far. And the left actually has a lot to answer for. And I think in this discourse, in this space, it's really important to hold that middle position and to really try to, in some instances, to not let our own political leanings invade in that more integral work of saying, look, this is an issue. There might be ways of addressing that issue. And that's what I'm kind of putting forward and trying to hold that middle position, although I can be very clear that I'm more leaning towards the left.
Tá. Interessante. Queria te fazer uma outra questão, um pouco mais teórica, Kevin. Uma pergunta que realmente eu não sei a resposta. Você acha que o fato da teoria junguiana trabalhar com um conceito de universal, como é o conceito de arquétipo, ela ajuda ou prejudica a discussão da descolonização? Por um lado, às vezes, eu acho que ajuda, pelo fato de tomar o universal como alguma coisa que permitiria uma certa legitimidade a diversos discursos. Por outro lado, eu acho que prejudica se o universal aparece como uma espécie de apagamento da história. Queria saber a tua opinião. O que você acha?
Yeah, Thank you, Marcus. You're right. I think it goes both ways. If you have the more universalist argument, one could argue that, say, well, ultimately, we're all united, right? That difference ultimately is constructed, it's spurious, and what we actually have is the human race together. And knowing that ultimately there is a similarity, it should be the source of greater compassion and tolerance towards all people. And I see that, absolutely. But as you've rightly noted, going the other extreme and saying, well, difference doesn't matter, that could be equally hurtful to those communities that have experienced very specific traumatic histories that need to be acknowledged and honored. So I think what it really boils down to is, what version of Jung do you want? What version of Jung do you want to see? And for me, it really boils down to archetypal theory and the arguments happening and the discussions happening around archetypal theory. Do you see an archetype as something inherited, universal, or do you lean more towards the cultural aspects of the archetype, i.e. the archetypal image? And this is embedded in Jung himself, but more recently you have, well, in 1997, I believe, was Petteri Pietikainen, who first put out this idea of archetypes as cultural forms, which has then been picked up by Warren Coleman more recently as well. And here you see that even embedded in Jung. So even if we disregard the conversations that are happening in 1997 and 2018, 2020, at the heart of Jung's thinking is a real appreciation for that difference. And that's embedded in the archetypal image and his theorizing of the archetypal image, but also in the method of amplification. Now, Jung is not a historian. He's open enough to say he's not a historian, but there's something very historical about his method. So in going to other cultures and trying to amplify, to understand similarities and differences at the same time, I think there's some gold there to hold on to, that even embedded in that classical framework or that classical theoretical framework, there is a true appreciation, or at least an attempt to understand that difference. And you might argue that the real strength of analytical psychology is that within the theory itself, there's this tension of wanting to say something both universal about the human condition, something also particular about the human condition. And it's about holding that tension between the universal and the particular.
Ótimo, ótimo. Obrigado, Kevin. Vamos lá. Luciana Chimenez, por favor, Lu.
Kevin, obrigada pela sua apresentação, um monte de coisa que me despertou aqui para pensar. Eu queria te falar, assim, eu faço parte de um instituto em São Paulo que é filiado a um instituto maior no Brasil, que é filiado à IAP, né? E existem regras que esse instituto precisa cumprir, inclusive no currículo, né? Então, a gente precisa dar 80% de Jung. Sobra 20% para a gente estudar autores outros, que geralmente são os clássicos junguianos que a gente estuda. Eu acho importante que se estude o Jung. Para a gente se falar junguiano, a gente precisa ter uma leitura profunda, né? Sobra pouco para a gente conseguir ler as outras coisas. Então, eu não sei se existiria a possibilidade de, dentro de uma formação, a gente pensar nessa mudança curricular. Isso é um questionamento. E o outro questionamento o que será que um instituto de São Paulo poderia fazer se não vem a mudança lá de cima, né? Nós, né, os membros, os candidatos, enfim, a gente nos simpósios, nos congressos, a gente tenta fazer os nossos trabalhos, lendo os autores mais diversos, enfim, mas isso são nos simpósios e nos congressos, não na formação, entende? Eu queria saber a sua opinião sobre isso.
I have a gut reaction that probably that probably includes a few expletives, but I won't do that here. You're right. The change has to come ideologically from the top first, right? I mean, if you have such a rigid structure where 80% is this and 20, now don't get me wrong, someone whose first degree was built on hermeneutics and close reading, absolutely. I mean, when we were in first year at the University of Toronto in our Jung courses and Freud courses as well, we didn't read people writing about Freud and Jung. They just threw it at us and say, you buy this book and you read it and you struggle with it. And there's something beautiful that comes out of that struggle because it's your own understanding. So I absolutely appreciate that 110%. So I won't take anything away from that. Now, equally, I mentioned this and I'll probably elaborate it a bit more here. What does become concerning then, it almost promotes that there's only one way of doing things. And this seems to me going against the ethos of Jung psychology as well, to be in dialogue, right? And to, you know, if what Jung says is true, that thank goodness I'm Jung and not a Jungian, then that rebelliousness is built within the way we approach things himself. So I'm thinking more specifically in the UK context, when you have people like the very uber classical Jungians like von Franz, etc., they saw what Michael Fordham was doing and they're saying excommunicate him. What he's doing is not analytical psychology. And Jung is the one that tells everyone, just everyone cool off, right? Let Fordham do his thing, right? Let him be in conversation with Klein, with Winnicott, with British object relations. And he's created something very interesting, very lasting. So I think there's something about then the dogmatic way in which Jung may be taught. Again, I don't know for certain, but the way it may be taught and the ethos of analytical psychology itself, which is to rebel, right? Or part of it is to rebel and to think differently, to challenge and to think outside the box. What I'm really interested in, and I'm seeing this in, you know, some really great examples, but others, you know, some more problematic examples, is that our colleagues around the world, they have great ideas. There are different ways of doing things, different healing methods, different ways of thinking that actually can enrich analytical psychology, that can change the way we actually see things. But equally, I see, you know, for lack of a better term, a lot of just the repetition. So here's the idea, here's the concept, let's just apply it to China, or let's just apply it, I don't know, to Europe or somewhere else. And what I'm really interested in is not so much the one-way transfer of knowledge, but a true mutual exchange of knowledge, so that it's not just going one way, it's actually going both ways. And I think for me, that's what would hearten me, and to see that change is afloat, right? That yes, Luciana, you may be confined in your organization, right, to doing this in a certain way to build a foundation. But when it comes time for our colleagues here to put out their own contributions, it would be fantastic to see that kind of mutual dialogue actually happening, not just Jung applied in a different context, but Jung actually learning from a different context.
Obrigada, Kevin. Microfone, Marcos.
Sorry, Isa.
Oi, Clarissa, tudo bem? Vamos?
Vamos. Me escutam?
Sim, sim. Cadê você? Aí?
Bom, vamos lá. Boa tarde, muito obrigada, Kevin. Minha pergunta vai na direção da pergunta do Marcos. Uma das questões, assim, centrais da teoria junguiana é a perspectiva das polaridades, né? Persona, sombra, animus, anima. E essas polaridades têm sido lidas, muitas vezes, como um reforço aos binarismos. E os binarismos têm sido considerados, inclusive pelo pensamento decolonial, as epistemologias do Sul, como base de muitas violências, né? Base de muitas exclusões, preto, branco, pobre, rico, homem, mulher, essas classificações binárias têm sido bastante, enfim, né, têm sido bastante criticadas, né, como um foco dessas violências, né? E há algumas releituras, né, como do Samuels, que fala para tratarmos as polaridades como diferenças e não como opostos, né, como opostas, complementares e tal. Eu queria te ouvir um pouco sobre isso, como a gente pode ressituar esse debate, porque, para além da questão étnico-racial, também a questão de gênero tem trabalhado muito, né, para desconstruir esses binarismos, e a teoria junguiana ela é muito criticada nesse aspecto. Queria ouvi-lo um pouco sobre isso. Muito obrigada novamente pela sua apresentação e pela palestra.
Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. So, what I really love about analytical psychology, and especially, you know, Guy, when you were there, when we had those initial sessions and everyone talked about where they came from first. It's very rare that people go straight into analytical psychology as their first passion. And what I loved hearing about at that time as a student, but also as a member of staff now, is that how people come to analytical psychology, right? They usually come through an experience, through a different theoretical point of view, perhaps, or also a different discipline. And I think that's actually really, really important, because the way we begin to shift this binary opposition, right? This oppositional thinking, Clarissa, that you rightly noted, is so central to analytical psychology, is again, being open to that dialogue and learning from different disciplines where their methods, their ways of thinking might enrich what we're doing in analytical psychology. So Andrew Samuels has done quite a bit of this work in the plural psyche. He's talked about plurality, multiplicity for quite some time. But equally, in terms of the nitty-gritty, the actual doing of things, I personally have found my training in history to be very important, because what it teaches me is that things are never black and white, that there are multiple points of views, multiple things that occur and converge to frame a way we understand something, how we understand a particular historical moment. And you are beginning to see that in terms of how we understand key concepts. So for instance, in terms of anima and animus, Andrew has talked about the good enough father of whatever sex, that ultimately what Jung was meaning by the anima and animus was an expression of alterity. And it just so happened that within his context, that expression of alterity comes in the form of the binary between masculine and feminine. But obviously in our context now, things have changed, and our thinking needs to change with that as well. And I'm really pleased that you mentioned the idea of the persona, because that is definitely one concept I would like us to start rethinking. Because in Jung's psychology, the persona is usually seen as something negative. It's something to be done away with, right? That we get rid of the false wrappings of the persona and move towards the self. And I think that really gives the persona a bad rap, because ultimately, in order for us to engage in the world, we can't always be our true selves, right? In relating to others, that might be actually a very frightening thing, to be our true selves. So when we're thinking about the persona, the integrity of that mask becomes the crucial question. And this is Robert Hopke here, who's written on the persona. So it's not the case that the persona is diametrically opposed to the self. But if we can build a persona that is absolutely necessary for us to relate and engage with the outer world, if we can build a persona more aligned to the self, then we have a medium and container not only to express our individuality, right, and moving towards that larger goal of the self, but also to live with integrity and to relate and connect with our larger society in ways that are manageable. So I absolutely agree that there is a reckoning coming, and it's the job of the Post-Jungians to do this work.
Obrigado, Clarissa. Guilherme Scandiucci, contigo, meu amigo.
Marcos, Luciana, tudo bem? Grato pela oportunidade novamente. Kevin, hello, nice to meet you. Nice to see you, sorry. Bom, eu queria fazer uma questão parecida com a que eu fiz para Fanny Brewster, quando veio aqui para o Tiasos. Queria saber um pouco como o Kevin pensa isso, que é o seguinte. Deixa eu pensar melhor aqui. Assim, eu acho que tem uma... Eu percebo, e não só eu, né, uma tensão aí importante diante de... que tem um pouco a ver com o que o Marcos falou, do pensamento junguiano ter, por um lado, né, uma potencialidade muito interessante para lidar com a diversidade, com as diferenças culturais, por exemplo, e, por outro lado, ela ser um discurso mais fechado, universalista e pouco aberto às novas ideias, os novos conceitos que vêm sendo discutidos pelas ciências humanas em geral. Eu acho que... Eu queria saber se você considera que nós ainda somos, enquanto junguianos ou pós-junguianos, estamos um tanto... desenvolvemos pouco essa potencialidade de lidar com diferentes formas de pensamentos que não brancos. Só para complementar, o que eu quero dizer é o seguinte, que a Fanny Brewster coloca isso muito claramente no livro Living the Shadows, né, que o Jung ele teve nitidamente uma influência de alguns modos de vida, né, culturas não brancas, mas ele, todos nós sabemos, né, o quanto ele ficou um pouco resistente a isso e teve posições racistas, o que atrapalhou bastante a aproximação do público não branco no universo junguiano. Essa é a opinião dela, que eu concordo. A questão, só que ela fala, ele abriu, né, para outros pensamentos não brancos, ao mesmo tempo dessa forma resistente, mas ele pouco fez, assim, ele não está pouco explícito, né? Como, por exemplo, algumas culturas africanas, né? Que nos países da África em que ele visitou, podem dizer coisas importantes a respeito da psique. E um modo de vida que explora a psique de uma outra forma. Então, ele via isso como um potencial, ao mesmo tempo que via, às vezes, como algo um pouco infantil, a falta de consciência desses povos, que você conhece bem essa história. Enfim, queria saber se a psicologia junguiana teria condições de dar boas contribuições intelectuais diante dos modos de vida não brancos, aqui, por exemplo, né, tem pouca gente, mas tem gente fazendo aí o diálogo com a antropologia, com intelectuais ameríndios, né, e parece haver um potencial subdesenvolvido. Dá para dizer isso? Ou você não concorda com isso? Obrigado mais uma vez.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Isa. That's a really good question. So again, I think it's going back to this question of tension in analytical psychology and whether those tensions are irreconcilable or those opposites can't be reconciled. My gut reaction from a very practical point of view, and I don't mean to split it, but I am going to split it in true Kleinian fashion between academic and clinical. Now, if we're talking about whether analytical psychology is more up to date, as you say, with the human sciences, with what's happening, probably not. That's my gut reaction right now. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be certain aspects of Jung's thinking that can promote more dialogue, let's say, with sociology, with other disciplines that are engaged with, group life, etc. So there is that potential there. But on the topic of race specifically, I don't think so. I think we have more to learn from other disciplines than what we can offer right now. In terms of working clinically, what I've seen is that there is not much, but still a very strong and growing literature on being very aware of racial dynamics within a clinical setting. And I think in that regard, the Jungians are pretty close to trailblazing what's happening. Again, there are things happening in psychosocial studies and psychoanalysis as well. I'm not here to say that the Jungian way of working is better than or more than what's happening. But if you're looking across the board, and some of the names that I mentioned on that slide earlier on, people like Toynbee, Frida Fordham, they're writing in the 60s, right? Hillman's writing in 1975. These contributions are dating quite far back in the history of analytical psychology. So there may not be many, but comparatively, I think those authors are displaying that there is something to be worked with here. So yes, there are some, as Dalal has noted, Guy, I remember your reaction to the Dalal paper all those years ago. There is something inherently problematic to some of Jung's actions and to what he said, but equally, there is that division between Jung the man and Jungian psychology and the ideas. And although there are tensions in the ideas themselves, there is also that creative potential, and our colleagues are working with that creative potential. So I hope that answers your question.
Obrigado, Kevin. Deixa eu só parabenizar você, eu esqueci, pelas ações mais políticas mesmo aí na universidade. Ótimo saber isso. Obrigado.
Thank you, Guy. Come back and teach, man. We'll talk about it.
Microfone, Marcos. Microfone, Marcos.
Kevin, queria fazer duas perguntas agora para o historiador. Queria te provocar um pouco.
Sure.
Rasguei até, ó. Como historiador, como você vê o uso da noção de história dentro do campo junguiano? Essa seria uma pergunta. No sentido de que, às vezes, me parece de que o uso da história ele é usado, às vezes, mais para confirmar o conceito, confirmar a teoria, do que efetivamente um uso que poderia dizer mais, entre aspas, honesto, por assim dizer. Tá? Segunda pergunta, vou fazer as duas. Tá? Segunda pergunta. Quase como efeito também do pensamento decolonial, a gente tem assistido dentro do mundo junguiano o surgimento de categorias como alma americana, alma brasileira. E eu queria perguntar para o historiador, Kevin, se essas noções de alma ligada a um país, a um continente, se elas historicamente se sustentam, se elas, de alguma maneira, elas roçam, flertam com um certo essencialismo que torna a discussão um tanto quanto perigosa. Queria saber um pouco a tua opinião sobre essas questões. É pertinente o uso dessas construções ou elas são criticáveis, por assim dizer, boas de trabalhar e de discutir também?
Thank you, Marcus. You are provoking me. You're touching on my complexes. And the question is, do I give in?
Estudei muito para fazer essas perguntas, Kevin.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, there's a lot to think about. I mean, the first thing I'll say is, I wouldn't call myself a historian. I was trained by a historian of China. That deeply impacted me and the way I work. So there's obviously a lot of subjectivity in speaking about history when I started work on history and analytical psychology. So that's the first thing. Is history being used in a kind of rhetorical, and perhaps in a way that doesn't fit with the discipline of history and how historians practice history? Yeah, I think it's a bit concerning. And as Marcus, you're alluding to, this notion of a cultural complex, which can be potentially very helpful, I think is problematic for several reasons. So I think, one way to start, I mean, this is a whole other lecture that we can get into, but the first question to ask is how do colleagues here understand culture? Can I ask that actually, Isa, Marcus, any colleagues who might want to answer, how do we understand culture? So if I asked our colleagues here, how do you define culture? What would colleagues say?
Que silêncio constrangedor, pessoas. Vamos lá. Ajudem a imagem do Tiaços.
Can I say something?
Claro,
okay.
Antônio.
I would say something near of the artistic and social expressions of a time.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Anyone else want to? Thank you. Is it Antonieta? Antonieta, thank you. Anyone else?
Grosseiramente, acho que são formas de ver e organizar a vida, né? Coletivamente.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Eu posso falar?
Sure. Lorena.
Eu penso, quando eu penso em
Please.
cultura, eu penso nas práticas, né, do dia a dia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Fantastic. So we'll work with that. So thank you, Lorena. Thank you, Guy. So this idea of something very basic. Now, it's right on the money that colleagues find it difficult to define culture because we take it for granted. It's all pervasive. It's all around us. It encompasses us, right? It defines who we are, right? It informs the people that we become. So there's one definition of culture where it's something just in the ether, if you will. It's these practices that we come to know and that they come to define us in some way, shape, or form. So we can work on that sense of culture, right? That it's all pervasive. So for example, if you're speaking to a fish, you don't ask the fish, how's the water, right? The water is part of its existence, right? So there's one definition of culture there, okay? And that might be seen as more of perhaps the essentialist view of culture. However, we also define culture. We change things. So for example, if we look at, and maybe let me go to my own personal context. Growing up as Chinese in Canada, it would have been absolutely almost a no-no for my parents that they marry someone outside of their race, i.e. someone who is not Chinese. But if you take myself and my sister, we've both married people who are not Chinese. And my parents are very accepting of that, very loving of that. People change, cultures change. The very fact that our understanding of anima and animus as this binary of masculine and feminine to something more plural that it is right now is evidence that people change, cultures change, right? There's something more dialogical happening, that as much as culture informs us, we also inform culture. We change the culture. Now, in that vein, I would also say that no culture is ever monolithic. So although there's something about the water, i.e. the fish, there's something about the water that encompasses us and that we live in, there's also multiplicity in that space. So if I'm thinking of Japan specifically, and I had this conversation with a colleague the other day, this colleague is really interested in a very particular form of Japanese theater called No. So they have these masks that, depending on the angle, it changes the expression, which is very brilliant, actually. There's a very stock way of these narratives and how these plays actually play out. But that's one understanding of culture. That is Japanese. That is a window, if you will, to the Japanese psyche. But there are other windows to the Japanese psyche. So anyone who knows much about Japanese culture, you can put a hand up if you do. But there's rockabilly street dancing. Well, that's Japanese culture. There's Harajuku, right? These very kind of elaborate, colorful ways that young people express themselves. That's also Japanese culture. So there's something already that's telling us that culture is not monolithic, right? That there's diversity in that water that surrounds us. So here's the point. Depending on how you define and understand culture will define how you understand and apply the cultural complex, right? So are you starting from the position that culture is this basic thing, but that it's not open to change? Or do you start from the position that things are constantly being negotiated and shifting? Now, this is my problem. In a lot of what I've read concerning the cultural complex, there is that inflexibility that potentially we look at groups and it's easy to fall into the trap that says everyone in this group thinks in this particular way. And I would challenge that, because even if a majority think a certain way, not everyone thinks that way. There will be sites of resistance. there will be ways of doing things differently. And I think regardless of how small that number may be, we have to deal, love, and honor that difference. So the theory needs to be up to the point of speaking to that diversity and to that particular reality. And the same goes for history. And what I find potentially problematic is that, many people will only present one version of history when they're thinking about the cultural complex. It happened this way. It may have happened that way, but people argue about it. That's what historians do. Details are actually really, really important. And how you understand that history is going to shape the cultural complex you actually see. So take, for example, our talk today on discourses of race and racism. People who hold that position of power, who's actually, doing the interpreting, that actually really matters, because that will shape the cultural complex you see. I can be someone else and look from a different point of view and see a different cultural complex. I think this is a really important point that one of my former students, Barbara Karamanara, has made, is that ultimately the cultural complex is relational in nature. That you might see one interpretation, someone looks at that same event and sees something actually very different. And what it boils down to is that who actually holds the power to make the interpretation? Because if we think about that, it actually might be upholding a discourse that is very uneven, right? That is potentially upholding what we've been talking about today, that one group holds power and the other doesn't hold power. So I'll give you an example coming from Chinese culture. So we look at the rape of Nanking, and this happened during World War II, when the Japanese are invading in the Pacific, and en route to taking the capital Nanking, they basically cause complete devastation. They want to, root out the soldiers, and in the process, rape women, kill the children. Okay. It's seen in three different lights. So, and this is all down to language. Paul Kugler spoke about language in linguistics from the perspective of analytical psychology. So amongst the Chinese, that event will always, well, not always actually, that event is mostly known as the rape of Nanking, or the popular discourse around it is the rape of Nanking. Now, when we call something a rape, there are massive implications for calling something. It's an intrusion, it's unlawful, right? It's horrific, it's horrendous. That in itself is already shaping your memory of the event, okay? If I turn this and look at the other people involved in this, right? And this is going to the point that the cultural complex is relational, it's never isolated. If I look at a Japanese point of view, so not the Japanese point of view, but a Japanese point of view, some people would call the event the incident of Nanking. So there's a huge difference here already, that one group is calling it the rape of Nanking, the other group is calling it the incident of Nanking. An incident is a skirmish. It almost implies that there's something insignificant and not worth talking about. So again, power relations, controlling how we're understanding that particular history. And then the West is implicated, right? And more, I wouldn't say necessarily balanced, but other discourses within the West would call it the Nanking atrocity. So then we have another position. It's not quite a rape, definitely not an incident, but an atrocity. So something bad has happened, right? But perhaps not to the magnitude that one group's claims, and definitely not amounting to the incident that another group claims. Now, this is a very basic example based on language, but hopefully it proves my point about how we're employing the cultural complex and what our starting presuppositions are in terms of history. History is about complexity. And if we can advance the theory of the cultural complex to hold that complexity, then I think that's at the point where we can really begin to dialogue with other historians, with the social sciences, because not only are we bringing in this very interesting toolkit that we have in terms of the psychology of history, the emotion of history, that's something that Jungians are particularly good at. Fantastic. But in order to begin to do that, we need to appreciate that things aren't very simple and black and white. Our psychology or our theoretical lens is sometimes in danger of oversimplifying what is ultimately complex. But if we can build new theories that can take on and hold and contain that complexity, then that's where the real gold begins. So, there was, quite a bit to take in there. There was a question of soul as well, Marcus, which is very interesting. There is a language for that within history, right? It's called the structure of feeling. So a part of my critique of the cultural complex as well is that sometimes it's not very aware of where the bridges could be built. So you call it one thing, you call it soul. Others have already called it the structure of feeling. There's some connection to be made, but without realizing what's happening in a particular field, I think we need to be very careful about going in and saying, we have the answer to it. It's called soul. Well, actually, you know what? They had the structure of feeling. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about what soul and what the structure of feeling is and whether we can connect on some point.
Uhum. Perfeito. Kevin, só para amarrar um pouco o pensamento, então, o conceito de complexo cultural que pode nos ajudar a esvaziar determinados preconceitos, mas se não tivermos um certo cuidado com ele, ele reforça estereótipos. A grosso modo, ele poderia correr esse risco.
Yes, and it can also be a form of colonization, a violence that we don't necessarily mean.
Forma de colonização.
Yeah, a violence that we don't mean, but a theoretical violence nonetheless. So if earlier I mentioned that what I'm really wanting to see is not the transfer of knowledge, but the exchange of knowledge. Now, if we're just adopting this theory of a cultural complex, which is situated, it's contextual, right? It springs from its own historical moment and also geographical locale, right? If we aren't careful about what assumptions that might be tied to it, right? And then we just apply it into a context that it might not fit, that seems to me to be potentially, not always, but we have to be very careful about the potential of appropriation. What I'm more interested in is that, okay, there's this very interesting idea called the cultural complex, but maybe in the context of Brazil, some things are important, some things work, but maybe some things don't work. But let's start a conversation about what might be a limitation and to build from there. And as I mentioned earlier, Marcus, that tension is the groundwork from which new knowledge arises. So, this Jungian framework, and I may be exaggerating here, about always wanting to resolve tension, the self-regulating function of the psyche, that we just want to be in the middle, and have things nice, resolved, the hieros gamos, all those things. Yeah, that's nice. But equally, we can't forego the importance of that tension, right? Of being in that middle position, because in that combative realm, maybe, Luciana and I were talking earlier, maybe in that warrior realm, that's where true knowledge arises, that we're not always in agreement. And I fear sometimes that people, for the sake of being good colleagues, don't want to argue. And I actually think that's a real shame, because if we always agree, then I think we're being bad colleagues.
Perfeito, perfeito. Kevin, Temos 3 perguntas. Pode ser? Dá tempo para você? Vamos lá. Por livre e espontânea opressão, eu convidei a Camila Novaes para fazer uma pergunta.
Kevin, muito bom te ver, muito bom relembrar os tempos do doutorado, os difíceis tempos do doutorado, mas eu sobrevivi. Eu queria perguntar sobre a racial hybridity que você escreveu, sobre miscigenação. Somos um país, aqui no Brasil, muito, muito miscigenado, né? Diferentemente de outros países que não sofreram esse processo de colonização com tanta mistura. Eu queria saber sua posição sobre miscigenação, a posição pós-junguiana sobre miscigenação, e se você acha que ajuda ou atrapalha esse processo de descolonização, a tentativa de descolonização.
Thank you, Camilla. So yeah, again, and great seeing you. Your PhD was awesome. I know I bugged you about it not being a book yet, but well done, well done to you. It's going to come in print. So I'm looking forward to it, Camilla. I think, again, from my own subjectivity, my children are mixed race. And that's the reason I wrote that paper, was because of that, that feeling of not knowing what to do, of being unsure. How do you be a good father to mixed race children when you have these kind of competing points of view? And I think it all boils down to liminality, and knowing that this liminality is existing throughout our entire life, right? That we're always betwixt and between. And I think that's one starting position. In general, I see hybridity as a real benefit, as this, this expression of breaking down barriers. Equally, having said that, the shadow side of that is that then it becomes appropriated, that it becomes something in vogue, if you will, right? But I think the benefits outweigh the potential problems, because if we look at even what we conceive as being pure, if you look deep enough, there's that mixture already there, right? So if I'm looking at the context of people in the UK, I'm thinking actually of my wife specifically. She's British, generations of British, but her last name tells us that those original origins actually come from Sweden. So even those who might deem themselves British, if you dig far enough, are actually quite mixed. So there's something about the need for purity, or at least a semblance of purity, when the reality is it's this kind of, this huge mixture that we should actually be, really, really proud of. And I think that's where, as I mentioned in the paper, analytical psychology has a real strength, because it starts from a sense of being mixed. It comes out of several intersecting interests, ranging from philosophy to the psychology of religion, to history, sociology, ethnography, anthropology. And I think that is the real strength, that in that eclecticism, it can really help us to understand what I think is not so much unique anymore, right? That racial hybridity is actually the norm, that it's not the exception. And, I'd love to learn more about the context of Brazil. And as I was saying to Luciana, Isa and Marcus earlier, I'd love to come to Brazil. And when the time is right, when the world's ready, I'm there, absolutely.
Microfone, Marcos.
Obrigado, Camila, pela ajuda. Mariana, contigo.
Obrigada, Marcos. Kevin, eu queria te fazer uma pergunta, mais assim, um comentário de que durante a sua apresentação eu fiquei lembrando muito de um marco simbólico, assim, histórico na história do nosso país, que é a Carta de Pero Vaz de Caminha, do descobrimento, digamos assim, né, do Brasil. Essa carta foi encontrada, assim, recentemente, aqui, lá em Portugal, numa torre, e fala muito sobre esse olhar, né, de um homem branco, de homens brancos, mercantilistas, e que são os colonizadores de fato, que chegam e decifram, traduzem um código cultural ali a partir daquele olhar, né? E, então, desde então, muitas das representações do nosso povo aqui, do nosso povo, eu estou falando dos indígenas, mas que acabaram ficando, sendo reproduzidas para a coletividade, foi muito decalcada daquela carta. Então, assim, comentários sobre as mulheres, né, assim, as indígenas, sobre as vergonhas das indígenas, sobre a ingenuidade, né, na troca. Então, assim, as trocas que eram feitas ali com os produtos e várias outras questões que foram de não querer trabalhar, né, a questão da preguiça, várias outras questões, assim, que, de certa forma, assim, povoaram aquela carta e que elas são reproduzidas até hoje, na literatura, né, na mídia, em vários outros eventos, e que, em oposição a isso, como você estava dando esse exemplo do Japão e da China, né, aliás, da China, ou do Japão, agora eu me perdi, sobre o estupro, que, por exemplo, aqui nós tínhamos um sistema que era de dualismo, ele não era um sistema binário, então sim existia divisão ali entre as funções das mulheres e dos homens, né, na hora de exercer. Então os homens, eles caçavam, as mulheres cuidavam dos filhos, etc., mas não existia uma proibição de se deslocar entre as funções. Então, uma mulher que ela quisesse realizar alguma outra atividade, ela poderia, né? E vice-versa, existiam homens que ficavam responsáveis por essas outras funções dentro da comunidade. Então, esse pensamento dual, que eu acho que é muito interessante, assim, como um marco epistemológico nosso, né, assim, decolonial, assim, e que ele vem sendo massacrado ao longo dos séculos, assim, e que hoje a gente está tentando resgatar. Eu acho que essa sua fala de hoje, né, é uma fala que toca em todos esses pontos, assim, importantíssimos, inclusive essa divisão, né, binária também. Eu acho que alguém fez essa pergunta mais especificamente, e acho que dentro da comunidade junguiana, como a Luciana falou, a gente corre atrás, assim, né, como candidatos, membros, ou pessoas que não estão institucionalizados, assim, de uma forma submetidos a essas instituições que normatizam. Então, nós estamos correndo atrás, no sentido de promover eventos, de descolonizar esse olhar, inclusive, semana passada, eu tive um seminário em que nós estudamos o texto do Guilherme, que está aqui presente, um seminário de gênero, e o texto sobre ânima e ânimos, e isso é algo que eu acho que é essencial, assim, né, fundamental. Então, eu vejo luz no fim do túnel, mas eu acho que a sua fala, ela super encaixou com todo esse marco, assim. É isso.
Thank you so much, Mariana. It's really, really heartwarming, really gratifying. So thank you so much. I'm glad you've taken something out of it. Now, in reference to this document, very interesting. I don't know anything about it. Sounds very interesting. And I think it's at this point that we again lean back on this concept of dialogue, that if we're looking at the dialogue between history and analytical psychology, not only can history enrich analytical psychology can enrich our approach to and understanding of history. So adopting this particular approach and lens, my first question would be, whose psychology are we actually seeing in this letter? So my gut reaction, especially when Jung is talking about the shadow, is to take it back. Because are we seeing the reality of the Brazilian people in this letter? Or are we seeing a projection of the people who have written this letter onto the Brazilian people? So whose psychology are we actually seeing through this piece? And then the next question or next phase is to deconstruct that. So if we're looking at this idea that what is actually happening in the letter is a projection, let's go back to the history of those colonizers and let's look at what that potential history looks like, and maybe certain events, certain experiences, ways of thinking, documents, etc. How is that actually then being projected onto someone else or another group? Again, a starting point. You then have to be open to the documents, right? You might have certain theories. They may prove to be right. They may prove to be wrong. But it's that openness of seeing the value of analytical psychology, but also not being afraid to say when things don't work, because that's important as well. But thank you very much, Mariana.
Obrigado, Mariana, pelo teu depoimento, tá bom? Kevin, última pergunta, tá bom? Rose Carmo. Rose, por favor.
Nossa, que responsabilidade, última pergunta, né?
Caprichem, Rose.
Eu não sei se seria o melhor momento, mas, assim, acho que é importante e válido. Então, de antemão, agradeço o Kevin, a Thiassos, fantástico, e todos os colegas aqui. Retomando as relações de poder sociais, setoriais, raciais, de gênero, eu tenho uma questão sobre a descolonização cultural do olhar. O que dizer sobre como melhor servir, talvez, no contexto de todo o questionamento que trago aqui nessa exposição da psicologia analítica, ou mesmo da sombra, né, dos nichos não vistos, né, e até apagados da memória e da história, das minorias que não se encaixam dentro dessas minorias não vistas, né, que a gente tenta dar lugar hoje, dar voz e lugar, né, às minorias étnicas. E quando a gente tem minorias nas relações sociais que estão completamente apagadas e não vistas, né? É uma coisa que chama a atenção e eu gostaria de poder melhor seguir esse nicho, né? Gratidão. Deixa já.
No, thank you very much for that, Rose. And also, I guess my question back is that, within these organizations and trainings, do we have diverse colleagues in Brazil who go in for the trainings and apply for the trainings? And if they do, what are the pressure points? Is it an issue of funding? Is it an issue that analytical psychology isn't prevalent amongst different segments of the population? That seems to me important questions to ask. And then in the context, hello, Marcus's little boy, hello. And in the context of that, to me, those are the tangible things that we can then work on, right? So is it down to scholarship or funding? Is it the fact that these ideas aren't getting out to certain segments of the population? How do we get those ideas out there and to offer these different opportunities? So that would be my kind of gut reaction, Rose, to your comment there.
Obrigado, Rose.
Yeah.
Tá bom? Kevin, esse aqui é o Pedro.
Não eu.
So,
Diga.
Isa, does Pedro have a question?
Queria falar que o Pedro estuda numa escola chinesa. Espera aí, Pedro, vai lá. Kevin, obrigado pela tua participação. Queria agradecer imensamente a tua gentileza. A gente está aqui há 2 horas conversando. Para nós é uma oportunidade rara discutir esse tema com você, uma pessoa que está tão atual no debate. Essa questão, como eu havia dito, aqui no Brasil, ela tem uma relevância muito particular, muito especial. Nós temos colegas aqui como o Guilherme Scandiuti, a Carmen Lívia, que estão, de alguma maneira, fazendo um trabalho muito rico, muito interessante na discussão desses temas. Então, essa parceria nossa só faz com que a tua fala ganhe maior repercussão. Obrigado. Espero que a gente possa miscigenar brevemente em alguma hora, que a gente possa se ver, chamar o poderoso chefão Samuels para brindar conosco.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marcus and Isa.